Well, welcome back, everyone. This is part two of a three-part series on women in the New Testament. And again, we have Father Stephen Morris with us. Thank you for coming back. We look forward to it and hand it over to you whenever you want to start your screen share.
Alrighty, so to begin, I thought we would start with a collect. We're going to start by talking about Saint Fotini, the Samaritan woman that Christ met at the well, the woman at the well. And in some of the more recent supplemental liturgical material available from the Episcopal Church, Saint Fotini is commemorated on February 26th, which is a slightly different date from the days from when she's commemorated in other churches, but it's during Lent, so you have to take the space when you can find it. And this is the collect that is provided. O God Almighty, whose most blessed Son revealed to Fotini, the Samaritan woman, that he is indeed the Christ, the Savior of the world, grant us to drink of the well that springs up to everlasting life, that we may worship you in spirit and in truth, through your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever.
Amen.
Amen.
So if I can just be really fancy here. So just for a couple minutes, I wanted to show, here's a modern icon of St. Mary Magdalene. We were talking last week with her red egg. She's portrayed slightly like a Middle Eastern woman, and she has the red egg that she showed to the Emperor Tiberius, and she has her loose hair and red cloak. But then Saint Fotini, the woman at the Samaritan well, here she is shown with her jar of water, talking to Christ, and the well is this cross-shaped well in the earth there. Since they're talking about the water of life and the living water, which has always been understood to be a reference to baptism, the well itself is depicted as a font. That very often in ancient churches, we find that the font is a cross-shaped stone monument sunk down into the ground. And the phrase living water is an idiom for running water. And so there's very sophisticated plumbing in these baptistries so that the water runs into the font and then runs out again so that the person is baptized in living water. And you have to step up here, and then there's also steps down into the water inside. And the women would be baptized separately from the men because everyone was baptized in the nude. So the building in the back with the curtain is a baptistry. It's also a stand-in for the city where the Samaritan woman lives in. And the red curtain there indicates that the baptism it happens inside there. So I will stop the sharing. There we go. So let me just move so I can see everybody. The Samaritans were not popular people. You know, to say there is a good Samaritan is like saying there is a good black guy in the Southern Confederacy. That just is impossible. People just couldn't wrap their heads around it. And Samaria is kind of, it's in the very north of first century Judea, Palestine is Galilee. Then in the middle comes Samaria, and then down below is Israel. So you mean like in New York, you can cross the street and suddenly be in a very different neighborhood. You don't just cross the street and find yourself in Samaria. It's a hike. So you have to deliberately go there. And Christ deliberately went to Samaria at least once that we know about, because he talked with several Samaritans at different points in the Gospels. But the Samaritan woman is one of the most well-known ones. So she is also one of the oldest images found in the Roman catacombs. She is standing by the well in the catacombs as an indication of baptism and therefore new life that the deceased have entered into. It says right in the Gospel of St. John that she was a missionary, that she went into the town and told everybody, come and see the one who told me everything I ever did. And she is remembered primarily as a missionary. The early records say that she had 5 sisters and 2 sons, and she converted her family. And her sons, who became Roman army officers, were also Christians, which is a very problematic situation to be in, because you had to participate in pagan sacrifices as an army officer. So it put them in a very difficult position. But the early records say that after the apostles Peter and Paul were martyred, Fotini and her family left Samaria and they traveled to Carthage, which is on the northern coast of Africa, across from Rome. And so they went to preach there. And the records say that in 66 AD, when Nero was persecuting the church so vociferously, that they were all martyred, that she, her 2 sons, and her 5 sisters were all killed by the Romans, and that Fotini in particular was thrown down a dry well. And she broke her neck and she was killed by being thrown into the well. There's a very interesting article that you can read if you want at episcopalcafe.com. There's an article about reflections on Saint Fotini, which is an interesting compilation of some of the stories about her and the experience of an Episcopalian woman who is an iconographer and teaches iconography, and her experience painting the icon of Saint Fotini. So like I said, anytime anybody has a question or a comment, please whistle, wave your hand, get my attention, and feel free to ask. But I think Fotini, her name means light or light giver. And the Russians call her Svetlana, which is the same name in Russian. Svet means light, the same way Fos means light. So she's a very popular saint in the Eastern Church as a woman missionary, and as a way of identifying people in the gospel, and making connections with people in the gospel and having some familiarity there. So I figured today we will talk about several different women in Acts and in some of the epistles, and then next week we'll circle back around to Mary and Martha and some of the other women in the gospel. In Luke chapter, yes, June.
I have a question. How do you spell that name?
Fotini?
Yeah.
Photini. Photini.
Okay, and I have a question. I know that this is the longest exchange that Jesus has with anyone in script.
Yes, it's quite a long.
Yeah, and particularly with a woman. Would you make much of that, or is that not significant? But it is the longest single conversation and exchange in all the Gospels.
Right, Jesus. The Gospel of John has chapters 4, 6, 9, 10, 11. They all tend to be rather long, and each chapter is sort of focused on a particular story that goes on for quite a while. The Fotini episode, and each of those other chapters, there's a miracle or an incident and then a sermon attached to it. In this case, there seems to be, the sermon is kind of included in the incident, so that the extended sermon that results from Fotini's encounter with Christ is actually part of the conversation. So it's part of this. And the apostles weren't, the male apostles were not there. So the only source for this is either Jesus himself or Fotini, who told the men what Christ had told her. So it's partly the way St. John puts the sermon together with in the context of the conversation, which makes it such an extended encounter. But it's probably also reflects a memory that this happened probably several times and just didn't get written down in each case, that Jesus did give private tutorials, that he did preach into small groups as well as to large groups. And that I think it is very interesting that the one that's recorded is such an extended conversation with not just a woman, but with a Samaritan.
Yeah.
Yeah, Gwendolyn.
I just want to let June know that, and everyone, that the names are in the e-news, in
Okay.
the section that describes this course.
Okay. But I got my notes here and I don't have the e-news.
Right, for spelling purposes, yes.
Yeah,
Thank
Thanks.
you.
you're welcome.
Yeah, Mother Kathleen.
I just have to chime in to say we have a Svetlana in our parish.
Ah,
Right.
that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we can wish her happy Saints Day in February.
Exactly.
That's great. You know, Samaritans are really despised, despicable people. And the fact, and part of Christ's conversation with Fotini is that, you've had 5 husbands and the man you live with now is not your husband. Either she had a really incredible string of bad luck that every man she married had a heart attack, and then she just gave up and just lived with this guy without even going through the pretense of getting married, maybe hoping that this guy would survive. But she's not ever accused of being a prostitute. Samaritans in general were just licentious, despicable people. And so, of course, Samaritans would have, multiple husbands, multiple wives. And a lot of the early sermons about Fotini talk about the 5 husbands being like the 5 senses. And so that, the more you give yourself over to sin, you kill your senses, you deaden your senses as a way to survive. And we know that that's how people react to addiction, say. You deaden your senses in order to survive the inner pain. So the early sermons about Fotini and the whole episode at the well in Samaria are really sophisticated and very interesting. They're well worth your perusal to look up, like the collected sermons of St. Augustine or the collected sermons of John Chrysostom or some of the other collections of 4th and 5th century sermons. And they talk about also Christ having such an extended conversation, not only with a woman, but with a Samaritan. So that, I forget who, I think it's St. Luke who has the parable of the good Samaritan. So this is kind of John's version of that.
Okay.
So I was thought we'd I can find my notes here. Yes, in Luke chapter, I thought we'd stop briefly in Luke chapter 8, where it says there was a woman with 12 years an issue of blood, and Jesus is going to heal the daughter of this Roman, and this woman in the crowd comes up and touches him, and she's healed. And so it interrupts the whole. Jesus stops and says, "Who touched me?" in the crowd, and the men say, "Are you crazy? Everybody touched you. How can you tell? In this crowd, everybody's crowding around." And so Jesus stops and talks to the woman because she finally raises her hand and says, "It was me." And I'm sure the Roman, Jairus, was beside himself because every minute that Jesus delayed going to heal his daughter made it less likely that his daughter would survive. But Jesus stopped and talked with this woman, and she's the one who is said to have, her name is given as either Bernice in the early stories. She's either Bernice or Veronica. those are two versions of the same name. Again, like Bill and Charles and William are all the same name and different because they all mean the same thing. So Bernice and Veronica are the same name. So she is credited with then meeting Christ again as he's carrying the cross, and that she takes a cloth and wipes his face, and when she takes the cloth away, the image of his face is imprinted on it. We get her name, Veronica, from that incident with the cloth on the wiping Jesus' face, because Veronica is Latin for true icon.
Oh.
And so it's that incident gives her name, basically. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a way to identify her. And so that cloth is eventually taken to Rome and is kept in old St. Peter's. The one that was put, St. Peter's that's there now is not the original one. The original St. Peter's church had a collection of relics that included this cloth. And some people say it was destroyed in the 1500s when Charles V sacked the city. But the Vatican says they still have the cloth, and it's the same one that had survived the sacking. But a lot of places have very similar images. And of course, the most famous of them is the Shroud of Turin, which shows not just the face of Christ, but with his whole body. And that the shroud is said to have been a shroud from the tomb. So generally, there's also another story about a cloth with Jesus' face, also called the true icon, the true image, that Abgar, the king of Edessa, is said to have written a letter to Christ saying, "Please come heal me, I'm sick." And Jesus told the messenger, "I don't have time to go all the way to Edessa," which is it's even, if Samaria was a hike, Edessa was it was way far away. It would take much too long to get there. So Jesus took a cloth, wiped his face, and gave it to the messenger and said, "Here, take this back to King Abgar." And when the messenger got back to Abgar, he opened the cloth, and there was the image of Christ's face imprinted on the cloth. Abgar washed himself, very much like Naaman the Syrian and other people in the Old Testament would wash themselves to be healed. And then Abgar wiped himself with this towel and was healed. Partly, he wasn't quite healed all the way, but he was healed significantly. And then one of the apostles, I think Barnabas maybe, or Bartholomew, one of the B apostles, came to Edessa later and finished the miracle of healing Abgar the rest of the way. But there are a lot of these images of Christ's face in the ancient world, and whichever one is the original, the one to Abgar, the one at the tomb that ended up in Turin, or whichever one came first, the others are copies of it. And there's, how do I want to say this? A system for classifying these kind of relics developed, so that a first class relic is the original. Then a second class relic is a copy. And a third class relic is something that's been touched to either a first or a second class relic. So that, for instance, if you go on pilgrimage to a city that has one of these images, and you bring your own cloth, your own towel, and touch it to the image that's in the shrine, then now you have a third class relic to take back home as a holy souvenir, basically. But once you get back home, everybody else, it has touched the powerful talisman. And so it becomes a focus for the local people who didn't go on pilgrimage with you, but it becomes a way for them to access, the event that's depicted on the original cloth. So that these tertiary, they're third class, not because they're less than, but just they're a third of the way removed from the original. But these third-class relics are a way for people to participate at a distance in the original event, because not everybody could, it would take years to go walking across Europe to get to Rome or to Jerusalem or to Edessa or any of these, Turin, any of these places that had the old images. So people would bring their, cloth to make new images and take it back home. And of course, and then also people would sell copies in, at kiosks around the original, and then you could buy them and touch them to the original and then take that home to you for devotional use as well. So these were all ways, for people back home to access that experience. It's the same kind of way, we have a record, a woman from Spain named Egeria went to Jerusalem, and she was there for Holy Week around the year 380. And she took very detailed notes about what the services were like. And when she got back home, she was a nun, an ascetic woman. And all the nuns said, oh, let's do the services just like the way they do in Jerusalem. And pretty soon everybody wanted to do this. Other pilgrims went to Jerusalem, and everybody wanted to do the services in Holy Week just the way they did in Jerusalem. So it's a very human thing to want to access, this common experience. And these copies of the shroud, these copies of Jesus' face on cloth, were one way to do that. And so it grew out of the experience of the woman in Luke 8 who touched Jesus' garment and was healed of her 12 years issue of blood. Any questions about Veronica? She's commemorated on July 12th. So if you know any Veronicas, that's their saint's day. There is a Saint Veronica. What's that?
Sally, my grandmother's name was Veronica Madeline Schmierer. They named their daughter, my mother, Veronica Madeline Evans. And our granddaughter is Veronica Louise Jones. So that's a popular name up the line there, Father Morris.
Yes,
They have,
there's a St. Veronica's Church down on Christopher Street too.
Is that right? Oh, I'll have to go take a look. Not an Orthodox church,
Roman Catholic.
Roman, okay.
And I can make a point that's completely irreverent, which is not unexpected. But I was at a conference once, women's studies conference, Christian women, and there was a singer there, and she said she had made it her mission in life to write songs celebrating the unnamed women in Scripture and to give them names. So the hemorrhaging woman in Luke 8, she called Flo, and this one in Luke 13, the bent over woman, she called Eileen. And I've never forgotten it. I mean, it's funny, but it's the number of unnamed people.
Right, and also that's a very human thing too, to want to identify these people.
I find it very poignant that these people, and the Samaritan woman, until you've talked about what her name, as people later understood it, they're not named. They're just passed by. These things happened, but they didn't matter enough to get the name, and naming is so important in Scripture and other parts. So anyway, but that was her line about it.
Right.
I would say, just if I may, before we move on, that the third class relics collection, that still happens. That's not something from the ancient past that goes on now.
I have some.
Okay.
But not to interrupt your flow, Father Morris, but what that sparked in me is a memory of, it's the crown of thorns that one of the Louis paid a lot of money for to put in the Sainte-Chapelle, right?
Yes.
Is that actually an authentic relic, or does it have, or is it just
Louis IX? It's still in the treasury of Notre Dame.
Yeah,
yes.
Louis IX, that's right. Saint Louis, right?
Yes, that has many of the first class relics in Western Europe have a very painful history insofar as that they are authentic as far as we can tell, but they were stolen from Constantinople by the Fourth Crusade. Constantinople had an incredible treasury of relics. And when the Fourth Crusaders sacked Constantinople in 1204, they sent most of the relics back home to Western Europe. And the great collection of, most of the great collection of relics in Western Europe are the result of the sack in 1204, the crown of thorns being part of one of those things that were sent back home, that the French knights sent a lot of stuff back to Paris, including the crown of thorns.
Louis brought it into the city himself in procession. And Sainte-Chapelle is a reliquary.
It's a beautiful church, yeah.
Yeah, but it is a reliquary. It's just a large
It's-
reliquary.
But it's
So-
Louis the Ninth, because my Countess Agnes outwits the much younger Louis the Ninth earlier than in this time. She outwits him and holds on to her county. So if it's that Louis, then she wins.
Yeah, yeah. The ownership of those relics is a very painful thing. It's like the museum artworks that are the result of not entirely up and up collectors.
Pillage.
And how at what point do things get given back, do they
Yeah,
ever?
but the Crusaders,
Do they ever?
the Fourth Crusaders were just foreclosing on the Venetians, the money that the Byzantines owed to Venice. So they were just foreclosing.
No, that's we will come back to that another time. In Acts 21, verses in verse 9, we are told that we, presumably Paul and Luke, came to Caesarea and went to the house of Philip the evangelist, one of the seven, one of the deacons, and stayed with him. He had four unmarried daughters who had the gift of prophecy. So this is probably around 58 AD, and the four daughters are identified as Miriamne and Hermione. The two main ones are Miriamne and Hermione. Hermione was a medical student, and she is said to have opened a clinic in Ephesus. And she was a very accomplished doctor there. Now, the whole question about prophet, that these four daughters had the gift of prophecy, and we don't know that there's no record that they were martyred. So they were presumably fairly long-lived, and they may in fact have been the source for a lot of what Luke includes in Acts, since they stayed there and Luke had the chance to interview them and collect stories and find out what they knew and what their experience had been. But the whole, what is a prophet is a very interesting one. And because we also have, from about this same time, a handbook from how to run a parish outside Antioch called the Didache. And it says, don't welcome a prophet, but don't let a prophet stay for more than 3 days. If a prophet stays for more than 3 days, he's no real prophet. So a prophet is primarily a preacher and a teller of truth, a very astute observer of reality, of human behavior and consequence. In some of the Jewish sermons, they like to identify 7 women prophets of the Old Testament, one of whom is Eve. And so the whole business of a prophet is to understand the difference between good and evil, so that the Jewish sermons that say Eve was a prophet, she understood the difference. They really do not want to downplay what she did and say, she didn't understand, or try to make her out to be like kind of a slow-witted person who didn't quite understand. They really exalt her. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she understood the consequences, but she understood that it would also be a good thing eventually in the end. And it was because she had such an astute grasp of reality that she was really the important one, and that's why the serpent came to her first rather than Adam. and that she was really the important one. If the serpent could make her taste the fruit, then Adam was a piece of cake. So it was her fall that was much more important in the cosmic scheme of things than Adam's fall. But there are through the next 200 or 300 years of church history, all other preachers and prophets are measured against the daughters of Philip. That there in Eusebius wrote this famous church history in the 4th century, and in chapter 3, for instance, he lists these other prophets, some of whom are as good as the daughters of Philip, and some of whom are nowhere near as trustworthy as the daughters of Philip. So they become the gold standard of what it is to be a prophet in Christian circles. Now, the other thing that's very interesting about them is, did they or did they not wear veils? Because in some of the epistles, it's very important that women cover their heads. And in Jewish society, it was important for married women to cover their heads. There's no record that these daughters were ever married. But Roman matrons and Jewish married women would, of course, cover their head. Working women, poor women, younger women would not. So it was also a class distinguisher. Concubines and courtesans were not allowed to veil their head. So if a man had a wife and then 2 or 3 concubines, the wife would veil her head, but the concubines, courtesans would not. And then St. Paul also makes this very strange remark about how the angels care about whether men and women have long hair or not, which is a little difficult for us at this far removed to quite wrap our heads around. But it seems that long, beautiful hair on a woman was almost a talisman, an amulet against evil. So if you were going to be a preacher or a prophet, if you were going to open yourself up to the invisible world, you wanted to have long, beautiful hair as a way to protect yourself from evil influence. And short hair, dirty hair, matted hair was an invitation to evil to come in. And it was an invitation for possession. So that if the women prophets of the church almost always would have beautiful long hair without the veil, because if you veiled your hair, you hid it, and you lost the amulet properties. You lost the protective properties that would keep evil away from you. So then that shows up in a lot of other stories. Lady Godiva, Eve is sometimes shown with long silken tresses. Sometimes we say, oh, the artist just didn't want to show a naked body, which is maybe part of it. But the idea that this long hair would protect you from evil unless you deliberately threw yourself at it. That there's that part of it. And so gender, the angels care about gender representation. And if you present yourself right, then the angels will protect you. If you're a man with short hair and a beard, the angels will protect you. If you're a woman with long, beautiful hair, the angels will protect you. It's when you play around with gender presentation that the angels will say that they're not going to look out for you anymore. Mm-hmm. So another very interesting woman in Acts 17 is Damaris. She was present when Paul preached in Athens at the Areopagus, which was probably around AD 55. And of course, the first question is, why was a woman at the Areopagus? Why was she there to hear him? We know from other records that the Areopagus was the place where people collected, they got together to talk over the news and to discuss philosophy. around the sides of the Areopagus, you would have a whole series of booths or kiosks, and different philosophers would set themselves up with little schools, with little booths, and this philosopher would be here with his collection of students, and this philosopher would be over there with his students, and people could wander around and talk philosophy and take classes if they wanted to with different philosophers. Very, very high status prostitutes would also be involved in these philosophic discussions, because one of the things very, very high class prostitutes were expected to do was to discuss philosophy with their clients, that they were expected to be informed and educated. And in the culture of Athens, high class women lived very sequestered lives. It was these intellectual courtesans were exempt from that. They were able to stand on their own intellectually. They were expected to be able to have very intellectual, esoteric debates on philosophical subjects. We're not told by the Bible that Damaris was one of these high-class courtesans, but the fact that she was present when Paul preached on the Areopagus suggests that as a possibility. She may have been a Stoic. The Stoics were notorious for welcoming women into their philosophical discussions, unlike some of the other groups. We're also told that one of the men who converted as a result of Paul's sermon in Athens on the Areopagus was named Dionysius. And maybe she was his wife, or she eventually might have married him, because that sermon was notoriously not successful. St. Paul did not get a lot of converts as a result of that sermon, except for Dionysius and Damaris. Damaris was evidently martyred, and the New Testament scholar Richard Bauckham writes that anytime we come across the name of someone in the book of Acts or in one of the apostles' letters, it's because that person had become very widely known. You're not going to take up the space in writing the story down to bother naming people unless your readers would recognize that name and know who it was. So because we know Damaris's name, we know that she had to have been very well known in the ministry of the churches connected with St. Paul. So that's anytime, that's another thing, like in St. Mark's gospel, where he says, Simon the Cyrenian, the father of Alexander and Rufus, helped carry the cross. Well, why would you bother saying who his sons were unless the people reading the gospel knew Alexander and Rufus? That was a way to make a connection, that it was, the guys in the next pew over, the ones that always sit there every Sunday morning, it was their father who helped carry the cross. So anytime any of these people are actually named in the New Testament, that by itself tells you that these people were somebody. There's Lydia in Acts 16. It says that she lived in Western Turkey in Thyatira. She dealt in purple dye and purple cloth. We talked about her a little bit last time. She was a very, very wealthy woman, because it was this particular dye was very exclusive, and if you were involved, if you dealt in this particular kind of purple dye, you made a lot of money. We know she supported Paul and Silas and Timothy around Philippi. She was probably a widow, because there's never any mention of her husband, but she seemed to run the business herself, and she funded a lot of St. Paul's missionary work. There's Lois and Eunice they're mentioned in 2 Timothy chapter 1. Timothy was, Lois was the grandmother and Eunice was the mother, or was it the other? Anyway, they were the mother and grandmother of Timothy, and they were known for being very pious and very faithful, and they taught him everything he knew. which underscores the importance of women in the transmission of the faith. You know, it became how do I want to say, a stereotype during the communist period in Russia that the faith was preserved by the old women in the church. And they were the ones who kept coming to church when it wasn't safe. They were the ones who kept the church going when nobody else could. And the second time, I was in Moscow in the mid-90s. I saw this happen. I was standing in the congregation of a church one Saturday night, and the Vesper service was going on around me, and a woman who was youngish, late 20s, maybe mid 30s, came up to me and asked me, something that was clearly a question in Russian, and I was obviously a priest, and I had to say, I don't know Russian enough to understand what you're asking. I'm sorry. And the woman repeated it. And I said, I'm sorry. I can't help you. And an old grandmother came up to us and started talking to the younger woman, and then took the woman by the elbow. And throughout the rest of the Vespers, I watched the old lady took the young woman from icon to icon to icon and showed her how to cross herself, how to bow, how to light a candle, and was explaining who these saints were. And it was just to see right in front of you the transmission of the faith like that this is how the church survived for more than 70 years and would continue to survive, going forward. That the passing on of the stories and of the tradition from one generation to the next was just stunning to see. And we don't always appreciate the importance of that, I don't think. It's the people get, so-and-so wants to be active. We need a Sunday school teacher, sort of shunt them off into teaching Sunday school. And it's so important. It's so important. And we don't always give it the recognition that it deserves.
Perhaps because they were busy passing it down orally that it never got written.
Yes. That's very true. I mean, yeah, in the early days, of course, literacy was a different issue. Also in Philippi, we have these famous women. I can never pronounce this first one right. Evodia. The way you pronounce it depends on what kind of Greek you speak. Evodia and Syntyche. They in Acts 16, they were, there's another woman, Evodia, with Lydia. Maybe it's the same one, it's hard to know. But evidently these two women were like the pillars of the church in Philippi, and they had some big fight that you could just see, they were probably standing on two opposite sides of the church, and they were like ready to kill each other. In Philippi chapter 4, it says that whatever their fight was ready to tear the parish apart. And I think we've all known places like that. So we don't know what the fight was about, but they were clearly the two most important people in the parish, and the whole thing was gonna unravel because of them. We know that they were very wealthy. They were co-workers, co-strugglers with Paul. So they also funded a lot of his work. They funded the church in Philippi. The fact that he calls them co-strugglers or co-contenders, he uses this athletic reference. It suggests possibly martyrdom, because very often the martyrs were described in these athletic metaphors. We don't know for sure. Maybe one of them was Jewish and one was Greek, and so it plays out this Jewish-Greek tension that was so common in other parishes across the Mediterranean world. One of the women may have had Gnostic tendencies and the other woman not. So that we also see play out in many other situations in the New Testament. Maybe one ate meat and one only ate vegetables. There's all kinds of fights that we know about in the New Testament that could easily explain what these two women disagreed about so vociferously. And Paul begged them to be reconciled with each other, but he did not get involved. He appointed an anonymous arbitrator to sort of sort it out. Paul clearly did not want to alienate either one of them. So that also says something about how important they were to his ongoing missionary work, that he was not going to risk scaring one of them off or getting one of them mad at him. He did not want them to get mad at him. He wanted them, if they were going to get mad, they should be mad at each other, and they should really be reconciled. That would be the best thing. So this demonstrates, one, how important female leadership was in these early communities. And it also demonstrates how important the kiss of peace was at the Eucharist, that you could not participate in receiving communion if you did not participate in the kiss of peace. And how could you authentically participate in the kiss of peace if you were ready to cut each other's throats, if you had that kind of dispute? So Paul urging them to be reconciled. Also, there was a liturgical aspect to this reconciliation that Paul was urging them to embrace. That again, the Philippians, the letter was written in the mid-50s to the early 60s, which is about the same time as I said, this church handbook, the Didache, was written in Antioch, which is the handbook for how to run a parish. And the kiss of peace is so important in the Didache, and so we know it was important throughout the Mediterranean world in the parish churches. So whenever Paul talks about the holy kiss, it's not just a metaphor. It's a real thing that he's talking about, the liturgical kiss of peace at the Eucharist, and that you could expect people who were having real fights, if they shared the kiss of peace at the Eucharist, then it was real. That you couldn't just skate by pretending. A quick peck on the cheek and say, that was it. Any questions or comments about any of these people so far?
I just think it's probably worth mentioning that the Didache is the oldest extant liturgical material we have. And what's interesting about it is that when we read the Didache, how much of our current liturgical practice we can see there. It's really quite remarkable.
It is. It's amazing. Yes, Gwendolyn.
Yeah, there is a St. Lydia dinner church in Brooklyn, and I knew someone years ago at St. Bart's or Trinity that would take her son to it, and basically you just call up so they know how many people are going, and they sort of try to do this kind of house church sort of thing. I'm not sure if that's the only one or if it's a movement, but they have a website, and it's just interesting to know about it. I've never gone because Inwood is like 1,000,000 miles away from Brooklyn.
Yeah.
But it's just interesting that some people are trying to start up different kinds of things that are not necessarily in competition with the church, because they're being held at sort of outside times.
Right, and the fact that they would connect themselves to her and use her name as kind of their patroness,
Yes.
is interesting, because
Yeah.
she would not have cooked dinner, herself. She had cooks and waiters and butlers and maids. She did not do any of that kind of stuff herself.
Well, I think what they do is they have different people do the cooking, and I think people bring stuff, and it's a whole thing that it starts from preparing the meal to having the meal, and then I think they do some reading or discussion or something afterwards.
Yeah. One of the interesting things about the house churches that St. Paul talks about is that the layout of a typical Roman house plays into the factions that he complains about in Corinth, because a typical Roman house was big, but it wasn't that big. And so you would have the main dining room but then the parish would inevitably spill out. You know, you could fit maybe 30 people if you were really cozy in a Roman dining room. But then other people would have to be in other rooms around the dining room. And so they could hear, but they couldn't see necessarily. And the food would get to those other rooms late, you know, after the main dining room had been served. So when St. Paul is talking about you know, some people eat and the other people are still hungry, and some people are drunk and the other people don't have enough. Part of it is the layout of a Roman, the house church, and how just stuff would get distributed, you know, and it takes time. I remember being at one church banquet that didn't have enough waiters, and you know, the people up front were done with dinner before the people in the back had even gotten the appetizers yet. And it's, you know, people were pulling their hair out and going crazy.
But they did, of course, one of the signs that a local house church was succeeding is they would remove those walls, those interior walls that were not weight bearing.
Yes, if they didn't have
until eventually the family would just move out and the community would take over the house once they started removing the walls.
Yeah. But then also you'd have to, you know, one of those rooms, especially after the family moved out, the bathroom would become the baptistry, because that was the place where you had the water to immerse people in for baptism. So a lot of if you read between the lines in the New Testament, a lot of stuff you can trace back to just the layout of a Roman house.
There was one woman you didn't mention from Acts, the slave girl in Ephesus, I think, who had the gift of prophecy.
Right.
Does she count as a prophet, I wonder?
Well, she evidently did, because she told the truth, you know, she told the truth so much she was a pain in the neck. And Paul turned around and said, "Shut up, go away, stop bothering me." And she did, you know, her hair did not protect her. The angels abandoned her, and she lost the gift of prophecy. And then Paul got in trouble because the men who made money off of it got upset and took him to court. So yeah, truth telling was never the church did not have monopoly on telling the truth. That there were prophets and truth tellers outside of the church, and that the Greek philosophers were considered by a lot of the early apologists, the early Christian writers, treated the Greek philosophers as the equivalent of the Hebrew prophets, that they were the ones who got their people ready in a language that they spoke in a way that they would understand. And so this woman, the slave girl in Acts, is an example of one of these truth tellers outside of the official legitimate, with no official legitimate connections, but that nevertheless told the truth and got people ready for the message of the gospel when it came.
Interesting. Jesus has that. The disciples come up to him and said, "There's someone preaching in your name who isn't part of the club. Tell him to stop." And Jesus said, "No, whoever is not against me is with me."
Right. And then there are other places where where they took the opposite tack. So context depends on a little bit. I don't know if who was the first Stoic? I forget his name. But the guy that went around in the barrel looking for an on. Yeah, I'm not sure if the apostles would welcome Diogenes into their company, because he was probably a very unpleasant person to hang around with. But his followers, they certainly would welcome as the equivalent of the prophets. That they began to get the people ready for the gospel for when it came. And Plato, he was to the Greeks what the prophets were to the Hebrews. Augustine and a lot of the early preachers, Justin Martyr, a lot of the early apologists said that it was worth studying these people for that very reason. Whereas other people said you should never read any of those Greek or Roman philosophers; they're totally worthless.
Well, that was the whole revolution in the in the UK and in France when the scholasticism really took off. It was fueled by Plato and Aristotle.
Yeah, and so the rediscovery of these other truth tellers. So there's just a couple minutes left. I don't think there's time to get started on some of the other myrrh bearers. Let me see if I have any real quick people, unless you all have another question. Or
You did my girlfriend Priscilla last week, Father Moore.
Priscilla.
Oh, we talked about her a little, but Priscilla gets mentioned in Acts and Romans and 1 Corinthians and 2 Timothy. She is all over the place. Evidently, and she always gets named first. Priscilla and Aquila. It's never Aquila and Priscilla. She's always the one to come. So she had to be the main. She was the important one. She was the one people paid attention to, and they were Jewish. They were part of the synagogue in Rome, and they became Christians. And so they were part of the Messianic Jewish contingent in the Jewish community. But in what's the year? 41 or 49 AD, the Emperor Claudius expelled all the Jews from Rome. And so Priscilla and Aquila had to leave. It was like the end of Fiddler on the Roof. Everybody had to leave Anatevka. All the Jews had to leave Rome. And Priscilla and Aquila ended up in Corinth, and they met St. Paul there. And Aquila was a tent maker. So he would sit around and make tents all day with Paul to earn, to support them. And Priscilla taught, and she evidently taught Apollos. The epistle to the Hebrews, some people tried to say Apollos wrote. Everybody said Paul did not write it. Some people said Apollos wrote it, but everybody agreed that anything Apollos knew, he learned from Priscilla, and that Priscilla was really probably the one who wrote Hebrews. And Priscilla and Aquila were martyred as a couple, alas, later on. But she had her thumbprint is so important in Christian history and in Christian theology that the Epistle to the Hebrews is the Didache is the first how to do a service, and the Epistle to the Hebrews is one of the first commentaries on what does it mean to do the Eucharist. And so she had a formative effect on shaping how Christians think about the Eucharist and the sacrifice of Christ.
It's like a series of sermons, and she sweeps to a conclusion like Martin Luther King would sweep to a conclusion. The only thing that's missing is mine eyes have seen the glory. There's just a flow to it.
Yeah, sometime I have a year or two worth of talks about the Epistle to the Hebrews that we could go into. But she shaped Christian thinking in so many important ways.
I can't find the reference right now where it is, but the line I remember about her is that or I think it says they explained the way to them, to the other followers of Jesus, more thoroughly. In other words, some of the other teachers hadn't done it very well, but Priscilla and Aquila explained the way.
Right, well, they were the sophisticated ones. They were from Rome, and they ended up in Corinth, and all these hicks in Corinth got the real sophisticated, the real stuff from Rome. And
I have a question. Who would have killed them if they were already thrown out? If they were already expelled from Rome, who caused them?
Well, the Romans were, they threw the Jews out of Rome, but then they decided the Christians had to be exterminated. So it was because they were known to be Christians that they were
By the Romans?
By the Romans.
By the hand of the Romans?
Okay, I don't know. We're getting we're getting some kind of recording.
Somebody's watching the news.
Yeah, but we've also reached our time. So
Yeah.
we'll have to stop this very interesting discussion and pick it up next week at 5 o'clock. And we look forward to hearing more about the people you will introduce us to next time or help us understand better. Thank you all so much for
Okay.
joining us.
Thank
you.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.